In the new edition, Grey Knights can teleport 3 units for free every single turn, and their warded armour seems to be thicker than ever, with a lot of saves apparently going to a 2+. Let's talk about how the Knights of Titan will be playing in 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's latest faction preview for the Grey Knights, and it does look like there's a fair few big changes coming for them going into 10th edition Warhammer 40k. I'd say perhaps the single biggest change is just how much these guys can teleport around the board. Even with the shunting shenanigans they had before, I feel like this is going to even more define the way that the army plays, a whole load more than previously. For the main reveal today, as per normal, we've seen a few interesting army trends on datasheets and free text hints within the article. Perhaps the most interesting one is a 2+ armor save that we've seen on the Purgation squad, plus they do say that a few other units are gaining that as well. Teleport Assault is the faction main special rule. This will be across all detachments, and it's basically just repeated free teleport across several units all game long. If that weren't quite enough teleport for you, then their launch detachment is also called the Teleport Strike Force. I'm not super overwhelmed by their faction rule, which is basically a boost to advance moves. I feel like the stratagems and other buffs that it brings might be the more exciting part. Then, as per normal, we've got a couple of rules previews, 2 stratagems, both for a pricey 2 CP, the Purifier's Purifying Flame rule, which is now a shooting attack, and then some useful datasheets to see, including the Purgation squad and the Grandmaster Nemesis Dreadknight. And between all their war gear, that does give us a decent amount of idea as to how a lot of the Grey Knight lineup will be functioning. Starting out by a few of the big army trends, the army does get leadership 6+, which is basically what you'd expect for Space Marines now. Nothing too unexpected there. They will be susceptible to battle shock, but seeing as things like Necron Warriors and Adeptus Custodes are, that's not really any big surprise. I'd say one of the main things that I wasn't really expecting is that it appears that a bunch of infantry units are getting a saving throw of 2+. Looks like Grey Knight Strike Marines and friends will usually be walking about in Artificer armour now. I'd say it's not 100% confirmed that literally all of their infantry will be getting that, but given that we've got it on the Purgation squad for guaranteed, and they also mention it in the free text in going across some other units too, I think there's a very good chance. A 2+ armor save is pretty fantastic going into 10th edition, to be honest. Lots of weapons have reduced in AP, which makes the save far more meaningful. It does appear that really quite a lot of the Grey Knight weapons have reduced in AP themselves, and it means that particularly if they get the benefit of cover, this will be very nice to actually keeping them sticky around on the table a bit more. Maybe durability was one of their bigger weaknesses in 9th. The new weapon for the Nemesis Force weapons, at least the standard ones, appears to be Strength 6, AP -2, and Damage 2. Again, we've seen this on the Purgation squad, and given that they do have the option of the falchions, swords, and halberds normally, I guess that will just be the generic profile that represents all of them, and there's a bit less need for magnetising your squads 3 or 4 different ways now. Overall, that's a good generalist profile, basically equivalent to the old-style halberds. These attacks do appear to have the Psychic keyword, which might be a little bit of a liability against some armies. It seems the main way of Psychic defense that a bunch of units get is generally getting a feel no pain against Psychic attacks. Won't be very good against things like Space Marine Librarians or Sisters of Silence. Otherwise, it appears that a bunch of stock things that the Grey Knights have had for a while now appear to be going away. My guess would have been before this that Tides of the Warp would have been the faction generic rule, but this looks like it's just entirely removed. This was the one where you could flex between, say, the Tide of Shadows and have extra defense, or other ones like the Tide of Convergence to go on the attack. There's no hints that that mechanic is remaining, though I suppose it might be realised on character datasheets, or potentially in different detachments in the Codex when it comes out. It seems that the launch detachment and the faction rule is all about the teleporting tricks. Similarly, at least on the datasheets that we've seen, it doesn't look like there's any innate defense against other mortal wounds or psychic attacks. That was something that was pretty helpful for the Grey Knights to shrug off against some psychic mortal wounds, and it also doesn't look like they've got any innate benefit against chaos demons. Kind of a shame, as that's pretty fluffy for the Grey Knights to have access to. Again, I suppose it might be realised on character datasheets or other things, though I must admit from a game design perspective it's not always the most helpful having one faction that is just set up to nuke another faction, even if they might be the specialists at dealing with them in the lore. Otherwise, apparently Deep Strike is still going to be very much a faction special rule. It's retained on all infantry besides servitors, plus the Nemesis Dreadknights as well, though arguably it might be a little bit less relevant given the faction special rule. That means that you can still start your units on the board, have the option of keeping them there and maybe counter-attacking the enemy if they get too close, or just deep strike anyway with their teleport assaults. Finally, again from a free text hint, apparently their psychic powers will still broadly be about boosting your own forces, as opposed to just dealing direct damage to the enemy, more Thousand Sun style maybe. I feel like that hasn't really changed that much from currently though. The emphasis of the big psychic powers tended to be about self-buffing from the Grey Knight's army, besides a few things like Purifying Flame and Vortex of Doom, which I'm sure they'll keep to some extent, maybe on the Librarian datasheet if I had to guess. I guess not every unit might necessarily have a psychic shooting attack though. It looks like the Purgation Squad don't, they just have their astral aim. Getting into the actual meat of the reveals though, and first up is this big crazy teleport assault rule, which now perhaps easier than ever will have Grey Knight units just bounding across the board despite slow movement, and it means that you can always be pressing up the attack or getting your units out of danger if they need to. I guess in a sense this does replace the Tides of the Warp, and even though Grey Knights didn't have one big unified special rule like this, they did certainly have options for a whole bunch of in-game teleports, things like the Gate of Infinity, personal teleporters, and that teleport shunt style stratagem. They could still do a fair bit of jumping around the table just through different rules, as opposed to having it unified in one core mechanic. Basically, the way that this works is that your units on the tabletop will be able to basically keep on redeploying as the game goes on, which is really quite a big advantage to some of the slower Grey Knights units that might potentially struggle to keep up, things like Strike Marines or Terminators if they find themselves out of position. You get to select your units to basically teleport assault at the end of the opponent's turn. That does mean a little bit of foresight is required. You need to know which units you're going to be moving in your next turn and think about it then. Then you get to redeploy a certain amount of units. In Combat Patrol you get 1, Incursion you get 2, at 2000 point Strike Force you get 3, and on big 3000 point Onslaughts you get 4. All of those restrictions seem pretty generous to be honest. I feel like you'll rarely want to exceed that cap, besides maybe in early turns of the game potentially if you want a big alpha strike. With big elite scary units that the Grey Knights can field though, that does feel like that's a pretty generous limit. There's no hints that you can't do this turn 1 as well, so I guess if your opponent had their first turn, you could potentially do this with 3 units in your turn 1, potentially having some very early game deep strike there. Then in your turn, your units will set up as if they were coming out from deep strike in the reinforcement phase of your movement phase. They've got to set up on the battlefield 9-inch horizontally away from the enemies, so potentially you could even have quite slow tough units right in the opponent's face, right from turn 1 or turn 2. The only major restriction with this is that you can't pull any units that were in engagement range of enemy units, so it means if the enemy charges you down and no one's killed each other, those units can't redeploy. At first glance, this rule does feel pretty immensely powerful to be honest. It's really excellent for countering Grey Knight's units' slow movement, and it means that they'll be able to get in the right position basically all game long. Your opponent can never think that a Grey Knight unit is out of the fight because it's too far away. In terms of how much it's going to help out units, I guess it's going to help out shooting units a bit more than melee units, as if you redeploy via this, you'll be able to get to shoot pretty normally. Whereas if you really wanted to make a charge, you're going to have that risky 9-inch charge to make, which is very much not guaranteed even with command point rerolls. I feel like it's pretty handy with slower units as well, might up the value on things like Strike Marines and Terminators, and make Interceptors just a little bit less vital to have. At least they can get onto the front lines, even if they're not absolutely guaranteed a charge unless you get lucky. I think that it's going to mean that when enemies are playing against Grey Knights, they're going to have to adapt their tactics. They'll really want to screen out the enemy very hard indeed. Anywhere that you can stop them deploying at 9 inches will be a win. I do feel like that means that this rule is going to be a lot more relevant against certain enemy armies than others. Big hoardy type enemies that can screen most of their deployment zone and the rest of the board are going to be a bit annoying to face, whereas really elite units like maybe things like Imperial Knights and Adeptus Custodes, they're going to have a lot more trouble screening out your Grey Knights. While the rule's really powerful and nice to have, I'd say it certainly isn't the thing that you want to use with all the units all the time. Teleporting units around basically means that you miss out on objectives, so it's not like you can afford to just have each unit redeploy via this each turn. Some of them are going to want to stand on your points, and anything that you need in combat will most likely want to remain on the board if it's in a good position to charge. If the enemy's screening well, then the on-board position might actually be more valuable than wherever you can move it to via deep strike. It does seem very, very handy to have though, both early and late game. Late game, if you're on top, you should be able to press the attack very, very easily and just have your Grey Knights turn up right next to the enemy home objective holders. And early game, it should mean that you should be able to get to the midfield pretty easily and take the fight to the enemy potentially in their own deployment zone. It's also kind of interesting that the sequencing of this means that you could miss out on Battle Shock. So say if you had a unit that was about to take a Battle Shock test because it was very depleted, you could have them disappear from the board and just teleport back down where they were. That way you've skipped the Battle Shock phase because they're too busy teleporting around to think about it, I suppose. Overall, it looks like a very nice faction special rule, and probably quite an unsettling one to play against, I guess, as you don't know where a bunch of the units will be winding up next turn. Just in case that wasn't quite enough teleporting for you though, then the Grey Knight's launch detachment is called the Teleport Strike Force, and this one's got a rule called Teleport Shunt. This one, I must admit, I feel like is a lot more underwhelming. I feel like it's going to be at least fairly niche. It basically boosts your Grey Knight's advance moves, giving your units a 6-inch advance and also fly. It only applies to units with a Deep Strike special rule, so it won't be for things like Rhinos or Razorbacks most likely. Things like Dreadknights and the standard infantry, as you might expect from the standard things that teleport. And I guess it's a handy enough movement boost whenever you do advance, but a lot of the time you're not going to want to, I'd guess. I guess it'll be pretty useful early in the game when you're trying to reach objectives and get units hidden in the midfield potentially, or maybe late game when you're trying to sprint to objectives and dealing damage isn't the most powerful. I feel like when you're actually engaging with the enemy though, it might have kind of limited use, unless say certain units get either assault weapons on their guns or they have some sort of rule that allows them to advance and charge. I wouldn't be too surprised if there was some sort of stratagem that allowed one or both of those for the Teleport Strike Force detachment, though we haven't seen it yet. I must admit I'm not quite as enthused by this one as others. It's definitely reliable advances, though there's every chance that you might have just been able to get away with whatever movement you wanted just by rolling the advance roll. And a lot of the time units aren't going to want to do that in the first place, say if they're big Dreadknights with big guns that want to shoot, or if they're Strike Marines and things wanting to charge. I feel like there's maybe a bit of overlap with the faction special rule as well. If you were thinking about advancing, maybe you just would have been better off using the Teleport Assault instead, and getting a free Deep Strike redeploy. Overall again I'd say it's useful, but probably much less so than the actual teleporting that you can do at base. Talking of stratagems though, and the Strike Force has two different ones previewed so far. This first one seems fairly powerful in the right situation, haloed in Soulfire, and this one's a defensive one that you can use after your units either arrive via Deep Strike or using that Teleport Assault to redeploy them on the board. The defensive rule costs 2 CP, and it means that until your next movement phase, the opponent can't shoot ranged attacks at that unit that are greater than 12 inches away. This seems to be a rule that's fairly common with 10th edition, units needing to get in close to shoot with certain powerful abilities. I feel like things that might be most useful to use that might be something like a big block of Terminators that's just deep striked onto one flank of the enemy army. If the enemy army's got a huge gun line that might well have been able to pile some serious damage into that squad, then this could maybe mitigate a fair chunk of it. Otherwise, I guess it could be good to guarantee some victory points. Say you have a unit arrive on a far-flung objective and the opponent just won't be able to reach you with most things, but they might potentially be able to gun down the unit. You could use this to guarantee that that unit survives, and then basically have them score the victory points in your turn. Seems handy enough, but 2 CP is very expensive. You will be paying for that with the loss of other options. The other stratagem is also a relatively expensive one called Radiant Strike. This one costs 2 CP, and it kind of goes in with similar special rules that the Grey Knights could have currently, where you get mortal wounds on wound rolls of 6 with their psychic weapons in melee. You use this in your fight phase for 2 command points, and basically models in the squad attacking with psychic melee attacks gain the Devastating Wounds ability. That's the one where on wound rolls of 6, you trade out your damage for mortal wounds, so it basically means your opponent can't take any invul saves or armor saves against them. It's definitely not bad, and it's going to be extra nice against any high save enemy targets, but I feel like at 2 CP it's not really going to be auto use. With the new force weapon stats, it looks like most of your strike teams and things will be getting 3 attacks with strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2. If you're attacking with a 15 attack 5-man force weapon squad, you'd average around about 1 or 2 wounds that would trigger this rule, so around about 2 or 4 mortal wounds each. Definitely not awful, but bear in mind that's not a direct trade out. Your opponent will still be taking those wounds otherwise, and they might well have just failed their armor save anyway. As we'll see in a second, a Grandmaster Nemesis Dreadknight with a Demon Hammer with 4 rerolls against vehicles, that might have a better chance of triggering some wound rerolls if you rerolled all the wound rolls. If you did choose to reroll all wound rolls with that weapon, then you'd average 1/6 for d6 plus 1 mortal wounds on the enemy. Definitely could be very big if your opponent had some big saves and he converted that damage into mortal wounds, plus could be a bit more usable on units like that as it only costs 1 CP, again due to another one of their special rules. Overall, at 2 command points, I feel like you're going to want to use it either on an absolutely huge unit, or units like the Grandmaster Dreadknight seem like a pretty decent target, as they both reduce stratagem cost, as well as have a reroll wounds roll rule that works amazingly well with devastating wounds. Finally, before a couple of datasheets, we've also got the new profile for Purifying Flame. This was a fairly savage mortal wound attack before on the Grey Knight Purifiers. Now I'd say it feels a little bit more tame, but basically it increases their shooting damage output against light infantry. This one you get on top of their Storm Bolter fire is a single shot at 18-inch range, ballistic skill 3+, wounds infantry on a 2+ with the anti-special rule, and strikes at AP-1 and damage 1. In general, I'd say that this just makes them a better squad at shooting some lighter infantry targets. On average, if the entire squad was also armed with their Storm Bolters and he teleported to within 12 inches, you'd average something like 8 dead Termagants, or around about 2 Space Marine Intercessors killed. It's not absolutely enormous, but on a squad that's really quite melee capable, and you might well follow up with a charge, it doesn't seem too bad. It's not going to be quite as savage on the mortal wound output front though now. Finally, we've got previews of a couple of datasheets, and first up we've got the Purgation Squad. This one's currently the Grey Knight heavy support choice, the one that takes a bunch of special psi weapons. As mentioned, these guys are going to be going up to a save characteristic of a 2+, which seems really nice to have on battle line units, particularly units with shooting attacks like this, where you might well be able to get the benefit of cover from where they set up. With less AP in the game, this is going to make even your lightest infantry hard to remove for enemy targets, and I feel like with Grey Knights having a bunch of other 2+ save things about, like Terminators or the Nemesis Dreadknight, enemy AP is going to be really stretched. Otherwise, their stat line is broadly quite similar to before, standard enough Space Marine things hitting on 3s, and with objective control 1 as they're not battle line or the equivalent of troops. I'd say the most interesting thing from this datasheet is the special weapon profiles that you can see. The Incinerator seems kind of unchanged, D6 auto hits at strength 6 AP-1, and it now ignores cover. The Silencer has shifted a little bit. Previously it was strength 4 and AP-1 with the heavy keyword, now it's just strength 5 and AP-0, and picked up sustained hits for extra 1s on 6s. Overall I'd say that's probably improved, to be honest. A little bit more volume fire and strength there, and losing the heavy keyword is rather nice, as it was hitting on 4s if you moved before, which was kind of annoying. It's still not going to be very exciting on anything but light infantry though. Finally, the Psi Cannon gains +1 strength going up to strength 8, and loses its heavy keyword once more. It has probably lost a bit of effectiveness against vehicles, as it'll be wounding most of them on 5s now. Previously, it would have been wounding toughness 7 vehicles on a 4. Still though, broadly speaking, I'd say that's a small improvement there. Again, the heavy keyword was very painful on these guys, as you'd often want to move them to either teleport them into range, due to only having a threat range of 24 inches. Finally, it seems that the Grey Knights have tweaked Astral Aim once more, and it's going back to its old ways of being able to fire out of line of sight. Astral Aim is a psychic power that just always takes effect, no chance of perils of the warp or anything like that. I guess the Grey Knights are too pro for that, and basically all the weapons in the unit can pick up indirect fire as a keyword, provided at least one Grey Knight Psyker within your army can see their target. Indirect fire would mean that they're hitting at -1 to hit, and their AP would be worse by 1, so it's not a direct positive there. Definitely makes them a unit that's going to be hard to hide from though, and having multiple Psi Cannons will definitely have some pretty general purpose damage output. I feel like they seem like a good unit that could make some very good use of that teleport assault as well. They might well just be teleporting around the board, gaining line of sight on what they want to. It is very nice to have a gunline unit with basically a free redeploy every single turn. Finally, we've got the stats for the Grandmaster Nemesis Dreadknight. Kinda nice to see this one, to be honest, as it both gives us the Dreadknight stats and also some hints as to how the HQ version might work, so quite a cool one to see. Defense-wise, he's gone up to Toughness 8 from Toughness 6, maybe not too surprising there, given that the Toughness chart has been stretched. Still though, it means that any sort of vaguely anti-tank weapon and things like plasma guns will still be wounding him pretty consistently. He doesn't have leader or lone operative, so I guess that means that there's no way of other Dreadknights screening him from being shot, much as now. For damage output, it looks like his damage has been toned down just a little bit. Previously he was hitting on 2s, but now it's just 3s again. I guess maybe kind of similar to the tank commander changes for the Imperial Guard that we had in 9th edition. They're making the leader version of this datasheet have a similar sort of damage output to the regular Dreadknights, so it's just not a flat more efficient damage dealer version. I do quite like the way though that they've given him a special rule called Surge of Wrath. This is a psychic ability that really plays into the Dreadknight's fluff of being able to take down greater demons and things, and once per battle round in the fight phase, one model from this army can use the ability before resolving its attacks, and if so, until the end of the fight phase, if you're in combat with a monster or vehicle unit, you get to re-roll the hit rolls, wound rolls and damage rolls against that target. I guess that might well be a rule that might apply to the generic Dreadknights, we'll have to wait and see there, but that truly is a pretty apocalyptic damage boost if they can get them into the right targets. Usually, if you're armed with a d6 damage weapon, that's going to be double damage or more, so pretty monstrous. It is only once per battle round though, not once per fight phase, so if you're locked up in an ongoing combat, I guess that would mean that you're not going to get this twice. For the melee weapons, on this datasheet it looks like the standard profiles have been toned down a little bit. It seems to have been a big trend in 10th edition that a lot of combat weapons lost AP, and that is the case for all of these. The greatsword's still very general purpose, a strength 10 attack with damage d6, but only 5 hits now, not 6. And the sweep profile has lost a lot to be honest, still a big 10 attacks that'll be nice against hordes, but only hitting on 3s and strength 5 and AP -1, rather than strength 6 and damage 2. The demon hammer only hits on a 4+, so that's going to be kind of unreliable unless you're triggering Surge of Wrath. That one again only gets 5 attacks and is strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6 +1. Strength 14 should mean that you're wounding all vehicles on a 4+ or 3+ though. Finally, the Dreadfists do seem kind of bad now. Previously they were damage 2 and gave you a much increased strength. Now they just simply don't. I feel like you're even more incentivized to upgrade to one of the weapons than you were before. Finally, for the guns, again I'd say they have kept the similar sort of feel to how they had before. These three basically just feel like double the damage output of the Purgation Squad weapons, and usually add a little bit of strength as well. Yet the Gatling Silencer still has AP 0 again on this format, and sustained hits 1. The Heavy Side Cannon appears to have gained a pip of damage for its trouble, going up to damage 3, but only strength 10 now means that you will be wounding heavier vehicles on a 5+, not a 4 or better. But perhaps the one that's had the biggest relative improvement is the Heavy Incinerator. That one's got Ignores Cover, still has the AP -1 that it did before, and has now gained 18 inches on its profile, so I feel like this is going to compete a lot better than it did. Previously the stock loadout was to take Gatling Silencer and Heavy Side Cannon. I feel like a lot more people might be tempted by Side Cannon and Incinerator now. Auto hitting and extra AP I think is a decent advantage over the Silencer, and the range difference is a lot less severe. Finally, the Grandmaster Dreadknight has a rule called Heroism's Favour, which I guess would be one for the Dreadknight Grandmaster as opposed to the standard Dreadknight. This means that each time you target this model with a stratagem, if it costs more than 1 command point, it would instead cost 1 command point for this guy. Overall, this seems pretty excellent, as it's a big scary model in the first place that's usually going to be a reasonable target for stratagems. Seems like you could get decent value out of both Radiant Strike and Haloed in Soulfire on this guy at the very least, never mind things like Combat Interrupt if it made sense. As mentioned before, Radiant Strike does seem particularly handy for this, costing fewer CP, and potentially also having full rerolls to wound, netting you more 6s to wound for the Devastating rule. Overall seems pretty solid. It'll be interesting to see how he stacks up against the regular Dreadknights. My guess would be that Games Workshop will probably want to try and incentivize one of these, and then if you want more take the regular datasheet, though I suppose we'll wait and see. Overall, some pretty interesting changes for the Grey Knights there. I feel like out of the rules that we've seen previewed, probably the best ones are the repeated teleport strikes, and the news that the Strike Marine armor appears to be going up to a 2+ save. That feels like it's going to be a really big boost to survivability for those models. Looks like they will be losing a fair amount of their mortal wound damage output that they had before though. Tides of the Warp and mortal wound defense being gone I think maybe isn't great news for them, and I do feel like that teleport shunt rule from their detachment ability maybe isn't the most exciting one of those that we've seen. Let me know your thoughts though. What do you make of the new Grey Knight rules? I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page too, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.